My name is William Smith. I'm the editor of Art in America magazine. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. You can also pick up copies of the magazine here at the gallery. To my left is David J. Getsy. He writes about queer and transgender tactics in modern and contemporary art with a focus on histories of abstraction, sculpture, and performance. He's a professor of art history at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and among his recent publications is the book Abstract Bodies, 60s Sculpture in the Expanded Field of Gender. And that was published by Yale University Press in 2015. To my right is Jonathan David Katz, who until recently was the director of the doctoral program in visual studies at the University of Buffalo, and is now at the University of Pennsylvania. In addition to a scholar, he's also a prolific curator. He organized Hide-Seek, Difference and Desire in American Portraiture at the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery. And he is the author of a wonderful catalog essay for this exhibition, Leon Polk Smith, Endless Space. And I'm glad that we're going to have the opportunity to discuss that in detail. Now that introductions are out of the way, I've been tasked with establishing some of the general terms of the conversation. This is a really beautiful exhibition of work by Leon Polk Smith. And I became interested in his project actually by looking back at the archives of Art in America, which I do on a regular basis. And in 1974, the magazine published an important essay on Smith by a critic named Lawrence Alloway. Alloway was also a curator and had included Smith's work in an important 1966 exhibition at the Guggenheim Museum in New York called Systemic Painting. And this was a show that included a number of artists we'd associate with minimal art and also hard-edge abstraction. And Alloway was interested in how repetition and patterning and systems had come to inform abstract art. And I think his 74 essay in Art in America is a great introduction to some of the ways that Polk Smith's work has been received. There's a certain formal vocabulary around hard-edge abstraction that Alloway really pins down, looking at the relationships between color that Smith establishes, looking at how scale, the canvas shape, comes into play. He talks about Smith finding problems in painting and essentially solving them, which is one of the ways that formalist art critics had talked about American abstraction. Essentially, progress through art was discovering problems, solving them. And he looked back at the connections between Smith's work and Mondrian's, for instance, tying this project to a history of early 20th century modern art. And I think those terms are pretty familiar to us today, right? This is the conventional wisdom around abstract art, especially at mid-century, that it was a highly formal project. But there are other levels of meaning that I think Alloway gets at here that maybe sets up some of Jonathan's work quite nicely. Hard-edge abstraction, systems, painting, this is almost like a second career for Alloway. And you may associate his name as well, actually, with pop art. Alloway was one of the key figures in the development of British pop in the 1950s. And one of the key arguments that he made at that time was that high culture and pop culture, for lack of a better word, existed together on a continuum. And his entire scholarly and critical approach was about linking these two fields together. And I think one of the reasons why he was gravitated towards Smith's work was that he could see some of the ways this high modernist abstraction also resonated with other kinds of vernacular culture. So Alloway connects Smith's work, for instance, to Native American weaving techniques. He notes resemblances between some of Smith's very early work and cattle brands that he might have seen in the American West. And importantly, he goes into the ways in which the work you're seeing today, and especially the painting right behind me, which I know we're going to get into, is linked to photographs of baseballs and footballs. That some of these painterly discoveries about the relationship between positive and negative space were actually inspired by sporting goods. This is something that Smith talked about quite a bit. So Alloway doesn't go so far as to say that these works are figurative paintings or anthropomorphic paintings or paintings that deal with sexuality. On the other hand, he doesn't really preclude that either. And he actually distinguishes some of Smith's work from the other narratives around hard-edge painting that were being offered at that time, especially by Michael Fried. Allaway is very clear that these paintings are not about pure disembodied opticality, that if you look closely at them, you can get a sense of the texture of the oil paint, that you can note the artist's presence here, that there is something about embodied experience going on. And I think that's a window into some of the things that Jonathan has discovered in the work as well, sort of linking this sense of embodiment that maybe we can sense in the work to really urgent questions about how sexuality and gender were figured through abstraction in the mid-20th century. So yeah, I would love to hear more about your argument.
So basically this began because I recognized that within the seemingly apersonal terms of geometric or hard-edged abstraction, one of the striking aspects was that the artists in question, Robert Indiana, Ellsworth Kelly, Leon Polk Smith, Ralph Coburn, they were all gay men. And and that kind of circumstance sort of intrigued me. And I thought, what is it about hard-edged abstraction, a movement that seemingly resists any kind of question of identity, sexuality, autobiography? What is it that might have attracted them? And as I started to look at this, I came to realize, and Leon Polk Smith, I think, is the perfect instance of this, of the degree to which effectively hard-edged abstraction offers the opportunity to encode or camouflage bodily sensation in the terms of what appears to be pure formal abstraction. And everybody could sort of get it at some level. In fact, as you'll see in the catalog, he even talks about a collector who called his work sexy, and he speaks approvingly of that. So he recognized that some, at least, would get what he's going for. In many respects, what I'm trying to suggest in the work is that these are pictorial metaphors for prospects of encounter, of touch, of engagement, in which disparate or the same form move in proximity, and they begin to thematize the question of approaching one another, of potentially touching one another, of echoing one another. Terms that in Smith's own writing, he talks about how his challenge is to keep life on both sides of the border of any line. So that line isn't merely, purely a formal term, but also that which marks a distinction from one entity to another, and importantly carries a line carries within it the idea that there's a place between one entity and another where at least conceivably they can touch. And that idea that things can touch one another is actually profoundly important for queer culture at a moment when you couldn't speak in any other way. And so, for example, I don't know if you can see after one here, this is the earliest work on exhibition, but this is a work, its title even tells us this, that was made after a profound discovery that Smith himself admits was the defining discovery in his career, which is to say that he looked at a sporting goods catalog and he found a group of illustrations of balls. And he looked at the seams of a baseball, and he realized that within the terms of a flat image, the seams of the baseball nonetheless conveyed a sense, a phenomenological relationship of three-dimensionality, of form. And so he was interested in this play between the second and third dimension that form offered. And the baseball becomes something that he then really explores. And of course, it is a baseball. But it is also, I want to argue, a jockstrap, right? And he explores its phallic dimensions less in this work than in other works that I could show you. But again and again, what we find in his work, and we can just look over here, is this sort of thematization. And I don't want to necessarily require that it turn on questions of representation, though you will see in Smith, as here, a continuous play with the idea of what could be underpants, two figures touching and thematizing that. Or here, right, again, something purely geometric, abstract, but also engaged with a problematic of touch. And here, again, right, the idea of touching, of connection. So what Smith's work wants to do, I'm arguing, is to find correlate terms for embodiment with a distinctly, at least potential homoeroticism embedded within the most formal and resistant terms of art making at the time. It allowed, obviously, success in the market. It allowed camouflage, but it also allowed terms of self-expression that would have been enjoined had he been open about this kind of engagement. And in his writing, he continuously winks and nods at these other meanings in the work, and approvingly writes about people who seem to understand the work akin to the way that he does. You have to turn it on. Where it says mute.
Got it. That's better. Okay. Now, I'm not going to so much as take issue with Jonathan's account of the thematization of touch and embodiment as augmented through a few different ways of thinking about this. I mean, one of the things that's fascinating about histories of abstraction, up to and including the present day, is the ways in which some artists who live otherwise, who experience exclusion from the normal, because of their sexuality, because of their gender, sometimes turn to abstraction because it is a more open field in which to imagine oneself and relations more broadly. And so there's a long history. The history of abstraction is interspersed with histories of lesbian, gay, queer artists who have turned to abstraction. And it is a motor within that history that is historically quite important. When we come to an artist like Polk Smith, one of the things that's interesting is to think about how this aspect of his identity becomes funneled into the work. And especially at mid-century, when artists were thinking deeply about questions of the optical and the formal, these were things that people got into fistfights about, right? The proper status of painting. And so it's not merely this kind of play of like which colors one going to use, or is it'll be a shaped canvas or a rectangular canvas, but they felt very deeply because these were analogs for how they thought they were in the world. And so we have to read deeply into Smith's statements about the work. So for instance, he once said that he could take that any two colors go together if you get the proportions right. Now, from a painterly perspective, this is radical because there are rules. There are rules about what colors go together and what do not. And what things are pleasing and what things are unpleasing. And this has been the staple of modern painting, is thinking about how to productively engage with and break with the rules of color. And so for Smith to make this statement that anything can go together as long as you get it right and make them work together is a remarkably open-ended way of thinking about relations. And so we have to think again about how the formal terms that are being put forward are about that experience of openness. Now, where I would depart from Jonathan's account, there are definitely paintings, both in this gallery and more broadly in Smith's work, that do engage with and produce intimacy and touch and moments of contact that are tenuously and erotically kept in tension. There's also an iconographic vein through many of the works, and your essay pulls out some key ones in which bodies are evoked. But I'm also interested in the ways in which queer sexuality is not just about bodies and sex, but is sometimes about the daily experience of living under the pressure of the normal, of constantly being aware of being monitored, having to appear normal, having to wonder about presenting one's true self in places where it could get one arrested, it could lead to violence, it could lead to disdain, but it was never a neutral question. And this is one of the things that runs through queer experience across the decades, is the problem of disclosure and of making oneself visible or not. And it is a compulsory question that a queer individual has to constantly pose to themselves at every interaction in every day. When we think about Polk Smith's work, one of the things that I want to actually restore the optical and the formal questions from Alloway a little bit, because optically these works are remarkable because of the ways in which Smith expands upon some of the questions he saw in Mondrian. Mondrian, the De Stijl artist, reduced painting to its primary elements, black lines, white fields, and the primary colors. And Smith saw in that work the equation of form and space, by which he meant that a Mondrian painting doesn't represent anything, but that forms were interchangeable with the evocation of space, what was in the foreground, what was in the background. Smith runs with this in a really interesting way. And when you look around these canvases, what you see is this productive frustration that he's putting into the works that evoke spaces and depth, but then keep us from fully losing ourselves in the space. So when you look at a work like this, just because it's in front of everyone, depending on how you focus on the work, it can look like a receding space, a shadow cast across the room, all of these different ways in which we can see these radically flat objects, these ovals. When we look into them, they sometimes oscillate between being flat and depth. And this is one of the things that throughout all of these works I find interesting, is he's always showing us that these works can evoke a sense of a further space without fully giving it to us. And that he reminds us the limits of those spaces. So the line that's continuous across this 3-paneled painting, we read as continuous and as connecting these elements, but yet, of course, it is not continuous. There's all of these different elements. Let me just wrap this up, but this, for me, is what's interesting, is that you can always see a Smith painting in two ways. You can see it as flat, and you can see it as evoking depth. You can see the diagonals as evoking orthogonals that lead into space. So for instance, this painting right here, you could look at as a one-point perspective painting. But of course, things are rounded at the end, and we're reminded that we're confronted with these oddly shaped triangles. So there's always this play of being able to see something and see it in two different ways. And for me, this is what's interesting, because Smith takes the daily experience of being seen doubly, or being camouflaged in day to day as the thing that's thematized in the work. And we shouldn't forget that the other way in which Smith always confronted problems of disclosure and camouflage is in relationship to his Native American identity, which he acknowledged but would never foreground. And so, because he knew that that would cause viewers to read him only as that identity. And so there's this constant tension between surface and depth. And those are the formal terms of his play with the history of painting, is how to have both at the same time, depending on how we look at it.
I think that's absolutely right. And one of the things that's so striking to me about this idea of the inherent doubleness of all the terms of the work is the way in which Smith's work creates, in addition to the formal terms, this other realm of utopian possibility, a realm in which he can imaginatively engage questions of contact, of touch, of eroticism in terms that are finally, for a man who is working in mid-century, one of the most homophobic periods in American life, if not the most homophobic period in American life, it gives him the freedom to create this utopian possibility in which he is in charge, in which he need not worry about pressures or discrimination, and in which he can stage mini-dramas in which one can come to eventually understand that the hard edge can be pendant, can be organic, can have, in terms of the imaginary volumes, the actual weight and heft of a body of flesh. And I think that idea is extraordinarily freeing, and it says something about our art history that until very recently, we saw these pictures in formal terms almost exclusively. What makes Alloway interesting is that in his early criticism of the work, he is still, even though he's talking about it in formal terms, he keeps using language that seems profoundly embodied. He talks about weight. Now, if it's purely formal terms, why would weight matter? But he's interested in questions like weight. So you get the sense that he's harvesting, but not yet exactly addressing the lurking forms of these paintings beneath their surface. And in terms of the account of Mondrian, I think that's really absolutely right. But interestingly, towards the end of his life, Smith gives an interview in which he says, everybody associates me with Mondrian. But actually, I think the real artist for me, the real model for me is Brancusi. And I think that the shift is a profound one, because while Mondrian is about space and the projection of an optical space, what Brancusi does is turn the terms of that more fully volumetric and more fully relational. So it's not simply about space, it's about relationality. And I think that carries a furtherance of his particular investment.
I mean, maybe one other way to locate this shift is Smith lived a long time and had an extensive career over many decades, and so he's constantly reorganizing himself, would be to locate it. One of the ways in which Smith's work was located was in the relationship not only to hard edge abstraction, but the emergence of minimal and reductive forms, and minimalism more broadly. And he's associated with, sometimes exhibited alongside. And I think this is useful because he's also one of the earliest adopters of the shaped canvas, which makes painting sculptural. And so there's always this kind of play in between. And that's one thing that happens with the Brancusi. The Brancusis are meant to be the block of stone that are carved down directly, or with, say, like the Golden Bird in the Art Institute, it's a very simple form that, because of its material, seems more than itself, seems to float. So he's looking at those sculptural analogs, which is, I think, one of the reasons why Alloway wants to read these works also in terms of the bodily rather than the optical is because Smith is achieving something such as sculpture on the wall. But importantly, it's never just that. And then this is maybe we could talk about Ellsworth Kelly and the sort of difference with that, but because these works are still evoking relations and spaces. So, I mean, for instance, look at this one. If you see this, imagine these two forms as the representation of a dark room, right? And suddenly you can start to see space in it, and but at the same time, we never can fully settle on that. And I think that duality is interesting. Dan Flavin once had a dictum for minimalism. He says, "It is what it is, and it ain't nothing else." And this is, fine for an artist who made his art out of fluorescent light tubes that were represented and purchased, from catalogs as well. But with Polk Smith, I think we might reframe that to say it is what it is, but it's also something else. In that there are these kind of sculptural forms that hold the wall, but they also evoke these spaces. And that's where it gets utopian, and I agree with Jonathan, that they present possibilities and a freedom that's not bounded by the limits at the end of the canvas, right? That actually extend out beyond it. And that's a way of thematizing life and hope more broadly.
It's interesting you talk about freedom there, because there's a lot of rhetoric around freedom associated with an earlier moment in American painting, abstract expressionism. And I wonder how you see the idea of expression and self-expression maybe transforming in some of these works.
I mean, well, the rhetoric around abstract expressionism was about freedom and individuality, and that was taken up on a global frame as that was promoted as American painting. But it was only freedom for certain people. The idea of the expressive relationship that can happen in the space of the studio was defined as profoundly masculine and heteronormative. And we have all of these ways in which that rhetoric of freedom, people who are marked in some way, whether they be women artists who are working in gestural painting, black artists who are working in gestural painting, or indeed some of the people with non-normative sexualities who were also doing that, found that it wasn't, that rhetoric didn't fit. It's actually a quite universalizing and flattening rhetoric around individualism, especially at a time with in the 1950s, with deep divisions around gender roles, around questions of sexuality and race, and the idea of freedom as experienced in the confines of the studio was only for certain people. And so I think that's not the kind of freedom I'm talking about with this, so much as it is the envisioning ways in which the limits that one finds oneself encountering, such as the limits of the canvas, can be exceeded while being acknowledged at the same time. And maybe some recourse back to Mondrian will be helpful. So De Stijl, the Dutch movement that was a catalyst, if not the sole inspiration for some of Smith's work, was invested in universals. Mondrian, make everything primary colors, everything black and white, and those are the primary and first elements of all drawing, painting, or everything else. And there was an attempt to create something that worked for everything. Anyone who experienced alienation from a universal rhetoric, such as Smith, in many ways, could never fully think about one thing that would be one size fits all. And that's one of the things that's interesting, is that I think there's an aspiration to create pictorial systems, each unique. And we look around the paintings, they are not a single system. Each one is a new system invented that plays out how one could imagine broader connections, broader spaces, and formal relations, but that also retains its insistent particularity. And that's both through the shaped canvases, but also through little moments, like with this painting that Jonathan was talking, the like productive and playful asymmetry between the left and right sides of both of those diamond-shaped canvases, right? We want that to actually just be symmetrical. Like the pattern recognition neurons in our brain are like trying to make it into symmetry, but it's not, to remind us to look at what's in front of us. That's the big difference for me between Smith and Mondrian. Mondrian wanted us to see everything the same.
And I also think that one of the interesting things about freedom is that even within, for example, Pollock, and I've worked on this and several other scholars are beginning to work on this, we've misunderstood abstract expressionism in formal terms. It made it purely about what our eyes can harvest from the surface of the canvas. But in fact, Pollock did a conversation in which he talks about the fact that what informs his art more than anything else, and he starts to want to say something, and then he points to the beach grass. And he says, see how the beach grass blows up and down in the wind? That's what I'm trying to capture in my painting. And what he means by this is the élan vital, vitalism, an early 20th century belief that every form carried within it the possibilities of life, and that it was this imaging of life that gave a work of art real power. In fact, and I've written about this, he had a productive, complicated relationship with a photographer named Herbert Matter. Herbert Matter was one of these vitalist photographers who wanted to photograph synaptic responses, wanted to photograph electronic relationships between things to capture this idea. But he said, the problem with my medium, and he says this directly to Pollock, the problem with my medium is that when I photograph an explosion, an electronic discharge, what happens? I kill it. It's dead. Photography makes it past. But the great thing, he says to Pollock about painting, is that there's no past to painting. Every moment you see the canvas, it is as if it's happening anew. You become the vehicle for its reimaginment, right? And so you create it anew. And I think this idea of embodiment of life is actually one of the accredited strains in American modernism, a subterranean stream that actually was extraordinarily powerful in the development of American art in terms that we haven't understood it. And it is that stream, in part, that an hysteric like Michael Fried is responding to in 1967 when he writes the defining article of minimalism, defining in my terms negatively, but still defining, in which Art and Objecthood is the name of this article, in which he talks about the fact that what makes minimalism dangerous is that it sets up an encounter between the art object and the embodied viewer. He calls that theatrical, and he says that's the death knell of art. Art needs to be all about itself. It needs to be framed only within the terms of its own canvas. It should never reference, right, the viewer, the social, the embodied, the relational. And we now know, because this has been published very recently, that in a series of private letters to the editor of Art in America,
Art Forum. No, we didn't do this. We didn't.
Forgive me. Art Leaders, Art Forum. Yes, very important clarification.
Don't put this on me.
Yeah.
I know, because I know what you're going to say.
Michael Fried says explicitly, we're going to finally put a nail in that faggot art. And he recognizes, he uses the term faggot art repeatedly, and he recognizes that what he is calling faggot art is art that seeks to engage a relational invocation of object and viewer, that seeks to solicit the eye in embodied or phenomenological terms. He wants instead a purely optical art that forgets that we are embodied.
It's the discussion around the coded rhetoric of art criticism although I'm not associated with art form, is intriguing to hear today. It's like we're going back and reading against the grain all of these essays that feel very cerebral and detached from everyday life, but actually are enactments of incredibly divisive and important social discussions. And I wonder the extent to which that extends to native identity in Smith's work. David, do you have more to say about that? I know that Smith was an important supporter of the native art community in New York in the 1970s. He was a kind of mentor and supporter in particular of an artist and critic and curator named Lloyd Oxendine, who in 1974 actually organized a special issue of Art in America about contemporary native art. This was at the height of the American Indian movement, a sort of radical moment that galvanized a lot of native activists in understanding their identity. To my knowledge, Smith was not directly involved in that, but played more of a behind-the-scenes role. And I wonder the extent to which the rhetoric about embodiment that we see him embracing in certain critical writings can also extend to this discussion about native identity.
Well, maybe to bring it back to how artists talk about their work rather than the critics, because that's a whole thing.
Yes, that's
But I mean, one of the things that's helpful to think of is that, so abstraction always requires justifying analogies for why an artist is doing this. So it's never just putting forms down on a canvas. There's always some reason that the artist has priorities, that in the colors they choose, the forms they use, the size of their canvas, and that those are deeply felt and interspersed with all of these other priorities through which they live their lives, right? And that's how all the abstract artists I know who work, they work this way because they feel deeply about forms, lines, and colors, because they help express aspects of life more broadly, right? And so one always has to ask, when approaching an abstract work or the criticism of abstract work, what are the analogies? So for Fried, for instance, it was the theatricality of work is all about the passivity of waiting for beholders, and there's a dynamic between active and passive that he's very concerned with. And associations, exactly, and associations with a theater as being effeminate are also part of what Jonathan's talking about. And that all comes from a fantastic article by Krista Noel Robbins that was published in Criticism, by the way. But with regard to native identity, I think this is important because that was actually something that Smith held dear throughout his life. He not only helped bankroll and support galleries and institutions that supported Native American art, but he has a string of titles that associate this work with being Midwestern and being specifically about questions of his own Cherokee family relations. He also acknowledges, and this is picked up in the criticism, how some of his attention to color and abstraction are actually first, he cuts his teeth, so to speak, first on seeing Cherokee and other Native American blankets and pottery, and that the sensibility, the color sensibility, comes from his engagement with these communities through his own relations. And so that's always there. The idea of an active play of color and all of this was always, had echoes of these childhood experiences that he continued to stage throughout. And so that's how I'd like to think of these ideas, such as any two colors can go together if you get the proportions right, is to be thinking about how it's not just about getting two colors that work together, but thinking about all the different places where exuberant color he had seen before and gets played out in his history. And he always returned to that. So I think one of the ways to understand this more broadly is to think about, again, what are the justifying excuses for abstraction? And what are the roots? Because all abstract artists also, the history of abstraction is a history of finding pattern and color in pre-modern forms of visual culture and absorbing them into the modern.
But isn't it also the case that one of the recognitions of indigenous cultures is that art does not constitute a separate sphere of existence that art does not constitute a separate sphere of existence, that it's segregated from life. From Navajo sand paintings to Kachina dolls, right? Art is integrated into daily life. It is part of and not a separate arena. And I think that this is defining for Smith, because he comes again to understand that artwork, and daily life have continuous points of contact, that we inevitably approach work with the eyes that have been accustomed to life. We can't do otherwise. And one of the strange things about the 1960s were these repeated and forceful attempts to articulate life as segregated from art. And I think we have to look at what's going on in the 1960s when these forceful attempts are taking place. What's going on? Right, women liberation, civil rights movement, native rights, queer rights. We're seeing a huge social turmoil happening at exactly this time. And curiously enough, at the very same moment, the art world is aggressively turning its back on all of these social movements and talking about pure form. There is a profound and, I think, discomforting relationship between the two.
Maybe we should officially open it up for questions at this point, because
Yeah.
I'd love to have your perspective.
I was just saying that I can see where the attention to pure form would be a rudder, a philosophical and emotional rudder to the change. I mean, just like today's life, one wants silence instead of Twitter.
Yeah.
It's the same sort of
I
proportion.
I hear what you're saying. If I might be permitted to respond, I would say that within the context of the art world and its taste-making structures, I think the answer actually lies, which is to say that those who collected art, those who supported museums, were generally the individuals in the, using a contemporary term, in the 1%. They were not people who were invested in revolutionary social change because the social hierarchy served them just fine. Thank you very much. And so those were the people that the art world was responsive to, the commercial and museum world were responsive to, and they didn't want the kind of social changes. And so, curiously, and I'm being as ironic as possible, curiously, the accepted criticism created an art world and validated an art world that was definitionally segregated from these social revolutions.
And Leon Polk Smith, by being so formal and just insidiously being touching, he bridged that gap.
Or perhaps one could say, traveled successfully in a bunch of different worlds and could hold these contradictions successfully together.
Hi. Thanks for a really excellent discussion. I wanted to pick up on something I think you said, Jonathan. Wait, let me put my glasses on so I can quote you properly. You said until recently, the art world or people in the art world saw art almost exclusively as formal. And I want to say, when I started my career as a young curator, I'm at the MCA, and I would write exhibition labels. I would include biography because I didn't grow up in New York and in the 60s with all that minimalism and formalism. And I would be scolded and say, no, you just have to talk about the aesthetic aspects of the work and the formal aspects of the work. And I was just shocked. I was absolutely shocked. I'm a Midwesterner and was just agog. So even in the late 70s, this sort of schism that you talk so eloquently about and remind us of how wrong it was to disembody art from life and from the viewer was really in place. So I just wanted to, pick up on that point and say today's audiences maybe have swung a little bit too far, however, to the really looking at everything exclusively in terms of identity and one's accident of birth or background. So do you have any comments on that pendulum swing?
I think you're absolutely right. And one of the things that I am now paradoxically in the position of saying, it's not only about your identity to my students, because identity politics have become so triumphant. And what I've been continuously arguing for is a complex relationship between form and embodiment, form and meaning, in which form is as important as meaning. And the relationship between the two is the real text of any work of art. And I find it very curious that increasingly, and it's worrisome, we are seeing police actions. They used to be police actions on the part of the formalists. They said you couldn't talk about biography. But now we're seeing police actions in which an artist of a particular ethnicity or racial group will say, you can't work on this because you're not X, right? And that is equally troublesome.
That is, yes.
If I can follow up on one point, I think, David, you brought up the notion of camouflage, or perhaps that was Jonathan, as a, and it does seem like there are elements of camouflage at play in the way that both artists and critics talked about this work. And the upside to that is that the artists and critics were able to operate freely, or more or less freely, within a certain sphere. But one of the downsides potentially is that a broader public didn't have access to some of the real conversations and layers of meaning that were accruing around this work. And so a sort of strict emphasis on formal analysis as the public rhetoric around abstraction maybe has the consequence of sort of separating art from other conversations in a very severe way.
Hi. Just in this conversation about art, or the formalist art being removed from social, perceived to be removed from social context, the only way to expand the public worldview is to create spaces outside of the current ideology, and that's what this work and other formalist work does. So in my opinion, this is opening, all of the work in this vein opened up a space for then, it's important in itself, but it also allowed for what came behind it that is much more directly addressing social issues.
Well, one thing, maybe one way to think about this is that we also shouldn't overburden artists by having to be everything for us and the avatars of our age. Because, again, it's important to, while I think it's essential to talk about aspects of identity and experience that have not been able to be talked about or have been suppressed, in terms of race, gender, and sexuality and class, for instance. We also have to remember that the life of an artist is always more than that, and that while a retrospective historical view of these tendencies, for instance, the 60s as a period of rapid social upheaval that is accompanied by a radical embrace of form from many different camps in the 1960s. In that time, what the retrospective historic view is a question of why was the inside of those art institutions, why did it look so different from the agitation in the streets? But we also have to make sure that we understand the individual artist not as representing their culture, but as trying to just live in it and be part of it, and also follow their priorities through. And I think that's one way to think about this. And what happens is that when we find that, we shift that focus to the individual, we sometimes recognize that there are different ways of living as an artist, outside of those established institutions. And that's what history then needs to find, is all of the people who were not, exhibiting in these same galleries, but who had taken the life of an artist but to do other things. For instance, to create agitprop and posters and the visual culture of protest movements. And so, but to balance those together by thinking of them both as different ways in which an individual artist found the way to make it through their day, right? And to think of it at that level, and that allows us to assess the broader range of how to think about these social and political things. Because the radically reductive artists did actually believe they were being political too.
Right.
There's artists who believed that, Donald Judd believed if you reduced everything to visual facts, at least they could be verified in an era that, in which facts were at issue politically. And that was a political stance for him. So there's a lot of ways in which that's part of it, but it again doesn't match what's going on in the streets, in part because what's going on in galleries and museums has never been exactly what's happening in the streets in other decades as well. Right?
Yeah. And I think at this juncture, if you don't mind, maybe we might want to get into some of the other hard-edged abstractionists, because Kelly is a perfect example. Robert Indiana, another one. These are artists for whom I would argue the same operative dynamic is in evidence. Interestingly, Kelly sends a group of photos back repeatedly when he's studying in France that shows his new, he essentially develops hard-edged abstraction independently from Smith. He's in Paris, Smith is in New York. Smith was always very annoyed that Kelly got the nod from the art world. Rightly, I think, annoyed. But what's striking is that those photographs, which show Kelly with his images, often feature Kelly shirtless or nude with canvases on or over his body or over his shoulder. In one instance, with two parabolic curves written, and he's holding the canvas right in front of him so as to essentially turn his body into a female body, and he's got a kind of campy look on his face. So you've got this kind of games going on with the relationship, and for an artist like Kelly as well, repeatedly, there is this pregnant possibility of touch when you think about Kelly's work, about forms almost engaging. In one instance, even, right, in multiple instances, he even makes these sculptural. By the way, the piece that's in Lincoln Park of the two parabolic stainless steel pieces comes from that, is recycled from that early French work, and it is, again, an attempt to speak formally in embodied terms. And if you take a look at somebody like Robert Indiana, you need only read the canvases. The 1962 painting in the collection of the Albright Knox Gallery, which is dedicated to the work of Walt Whitman, has it's the famous circles that have words written on them. But if you read the words, it says, 600 feet long and stately, the great northern swam up my bay. Now, again, it does not necessarily carry any queer connotation, but I would argue for Indiana, it most assuredly did. Quoting a queer poet like Whitman and choosing the line about the great northern long and stately swimming up my bay, he knew what he was doing. But he was doing it in terms that nodded to those who understood and didn't to those who don't. We have to acknowledge the degree to which art always speaks out of both sides of its mouth. It speaks multiply to different audiences with different capacities and capabilities, and artists count on that.
And I mean, just to think about this group of artists a little more, let's remember Robert Indiana's famous Love composition, right, that we see everywhere. It's on view at Art Expo again. It's in many cities as now as a public sculpture. The initial formulation of that composition was a different four-letter word that starts with F. And it derived from the moment, the tortured breakup with Ellsworth Kelly that was happening, and that it takes on some of the colors of Kelly's forms. And so the history of that symbol of love actually comes out of a moment of heartbreak in a gay relationship. And that's one of the reasons, for instance, why the O that is tilted in love is not an O. It's a different form that we read as an O, and it's a queer O, you can say, in love, but we accept it because it makes sense. And that's another way of thinking about this, about that sculpture, and how it achieves a universal by allowing for particularity. With Kelly's works, I think there's a really interesting distinction between Kelly and Smith in that I always think of Kelly's works as fundamentally still containing a kernel of representation in them. Because one of the things that Kelly has said generates his forms are the chance views of things that are overlooked. The shadow in the room, the space of the doorway that you don't normally look into. So Kelly's forms derive from visual encounters with the world of things that one normally doesn't spend time focusing on, that are then transposed into these color fields. That is a queer procedure of looking at the overlooked, whereas Smith's work doesn't have that same kernel of the representational in it, because Smith is trying to do what Mondrian was trying to do, which is invent a new world and produce something that has this kind of duality between space and form, flatness and depth, edge and center, all of these components. But these three artists, thinking of them together, they're all trying to figure out ways to animate form or an art in a way that speaks to their experience in a broad sense of being overlooked, of trying to figure out a way to fit into a mainstream account of love, or of an artist who was always masquerading his identity as Midwestern, as Native American, as gay, and trying to understand all of the things that impacted his ability to make these works, but also couldn't fully be disclosed at any one time, and definitely not in combination. And so the only recourse is to invent a new world. And pure form, as it's called, or reductive abstraction, for better or for worse, is open in its possibilities. It's narrower in the ways in which one can read it, but immediately, but it's more open if you stay with it. And that's what these artists did. They stayed with these forms.
And
This has been an amazing conversation. I wonder, do we have time for one more question? I don't want to. Okay. Last question and the best.
One more question? Thank you.
Thanks for a great discussion. I kept thinking of the Wittgenstein's ideas of picture theory and meaning of language. And it seems to me like talking about Ellsworth Kelly and Smith. Smith veers more towards language. As opposed to the idea that any meaningful proposition pictures a state of affairs or an atomic fact. So it's interesting how you brought up Whitman and Pollock's relationship to Whitman as well, and then moving on like to someone like de Kooning, who, heterosexual, but there was a huge problem for a lot of people with the vulgarity of his work when he moved off into the women and the later women. So it seems like there's this undercurrent of sensuality happening in all this work that was really always there. And when you look at the work, it's sensual. That's maybe the ultimate thing we can say about looking at Kelly or Smith, is how sensual and sexy it is.
yeah. It's not for nothing that the terms that we use to describe a person of erotic interest to us and the terms that we use to describe a picture that appeals to us are often the same.
Yeah. How about that?
maybe that's a really nice way to end it. Thank you, David Getsy, Jonathan. Thanks. Thank you very much.